This is episode 2 of my working LEGO bowling alley, and we're starting with the lane framework. With that orange track in, let's drop some bowling balls down, and we can see them roll across. Now, let's use some plates to strengthen the core so that way we can put the lane on top. The lane has tabs on the back which fit into slots, so that way when it's placed on top, it's nice and secure. With the lane in place, let's begin the pin sweep. After building up some walls, we can see this mechanism here, which has a rotating arm, a pivot arm, and the pin sweep that goes into that rail, and then back. And then, once it's brought forward, it then hits that wall and rotates up. Once it is rotated all the way up, it can then go back down by just rotating the other way. It first pushes it down, and then into that track, so then it only moves linearly. With our track in place on the right side, now it's time to duplicate it on the left side. After building up those walls, we can use that same mechanism in the track on the left side. And in our next episode, we'll connect those both together, because now it's time for the Pinsetter. In a previous video, I designed this manual Pinsetter, and while it worked decently well, it had a couple flaws. Here we can see that if I try and drop the pins, sometimes that middle one would get stuck. I thought about using Technic pieces instead, since compared to normal bricks which hold pretty tight, they have a little bit of gap between the edges. But accommodating 10 pins would be quite difficult, so instead I'm going to strengthen the original idea so that way the pins can slide through. Looking at the mechanism, we have that plate and tile which can move back and forth. The pins sit on top of those until it moves back and it falls. Then the Pinsetter can go up, and then it'll go back down, and that plate and tile move in place to then pick up the pin, and once it goes back down, they can slide back to release it. Redesigning that mechanism through the use of these plates and tiles allowed the pins to slide much easier. So now let's connect the motor on top. The motor is connected to an 8-tooth gear, which through the use of a gear rack is able to slide those forwards and backwards. Well, not yet. After strengthening that, now it's able to move it forward and backwards. And if we load a pin into the Pinsetter, it doesn't get stuck. Now it's time for the upper pin rack. This is where the pins get stored until it's ready for the Pinsetter, but right now they're getting caught on the connecting joints. But they can go through only when it's tilted enough to where they would fall out anyways. So a quick redesign using a bunch of the L beams allows the pins to sit there until it's lifted up and they stand up. So with those done, now we need to be able to install this to where it can move up and down. While I was going to use these linear tracks, I decided we don't have enough space for them, and instead we're going to use beams on the back here with a trailing arm to keep it in the right vertical position. Unfortunately, this mechanism has a problem. When it's all the way up or down, it has a major difference of about 6 studs, but luckily we're only moving it up and down about 3 blocks, so it's only about a half stud difference. Now we can connect those beams to the rods in the back of the Pinsetter, and it's able to be raised up and lowered down. Next, we can install the upper pin rack. This is what holds the pins until all 10 of them are ready and the Pinsetter is ready for them to be deposited. After putting a couple pins in place, now we can test it. We're going to raise the Pinsetter up, and then we're going to try and drop the pins into their slots. But they missed. So after installing a couple bricks between the slots, now they are all guided into the right slot. Now it's time for some motors. This motor connects to the pin rack to be able to deposit the pins into the Pinsetter. Next is a motor for the Pinsetter itself, but it's too wobbly right now. I'm going to use some brackets and some other Technic beams to be able to strengthen the Pinsetter. With that added strength, it's now time to motorize it. My first idea was to use string and gear it down to a 1:3 ratio, but that still just wasn't strong enough. Here we can see just how heavy it is, so instead I'm going to attach beams that go way out there. While it is still quite heavy from out there, it makes the vantage point a lot better, and if we add a counterweight, which happens to just be a bunch of coins, it now basically floats. Using just one finger, I'm able to move it, and then it just floats back up. So we can use a motor attached with just a simple arm to be able to lift it. Now we can see that by just spinning the motor, it's able to easily lift and lower the Pinsetter. With the pin setter now being able to be lifted and lowered, I can move on to the last detail. Now that button is pressed once that deposits the pins. So that way in our next episode, we can work on the pin distributor, which takes the pins from the pin cycler into the pin rack. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.